It started like most of these stories do, in a place most people have never heard of. A small ranch, 40 minutes outside the nearest gas station, tucked into the kind of open country where the sky feels too big and the silence feels too loud. The Hensley family had lived there for 3 generations. Cattle, a few horses, a stretch of land that swallowed the horizon, and a dog named Duke, who'd been part of that family for almost 9 years. Duke was a mutt, part shepherd, part something nobody could quite place. He was the kind of dog who barked at strangers, slept at the foot of the youngest daughter's bed, and never once, in 9 years, gave anyone in that family a single reason to be afraid of him. Until the spring of last year, when everything about Duke started to change. It began small. The kind of small you almost don't notice until you're forced to. He stopped eating from his usual spot by the porch. He'd carry his food in his mouth, out past the tree line, and eat alone, facing away from the house. He stopped sleeping inside. For 9 years, Duke had slept at the foot of a bed. Now he wouldn't come past the doorway. He'd just stand there in the dark hallway, staring in. Not at the daughter, not at anyone in particular. Just staring at nothing for longer than a dog should be able to hold still. The mother, Carla Hensley, was the first to say something felt wrong. She'd catch Duke watching her from across the yard, and when she'd call his name, he wouldn't come right away. He'd tilt his head, first, slow, unnatural, almost too far to one side, before he moved. She mentioned it to her husband, Roy, half joking. "Something's off with that dog lately." Roy laughed it off. "Dogs get old, dogs get weird," that's what he told her. But then he saw it too. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Chores mostly done, the light just starting to go gray at the edges. Roy was walking back from the barn when he saw Duke sitting near the fence line, perfectly still, facing the house. Roy called out to him. Duke turned his head toward the sound, and Roy said later that for 1 full second, maybe 2, Duke's face didn't look like a dog's face at all. He couldn't explain it any better than that. Not longer teeth, not glowing eyes, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's the wrong part." Just wrong. All over. Like something was wearing the dog the way you'd wear a coat that didn't quite fit. Then it passed, and it was just Duke again, panting, tail low, watching him from the fence. Roy didn't tell Carla that part for almost a week. By the time he did, she had her own stories to add to it. She told him about the eyes catching the porch light wrong. Not the usual green-gold shine you get off a dog's eyes in the dark, but something flatter, something that didn't track light the way it should. She told him about waking up at 2 a.m. to the sound of something walking on 2 legs across the porch, slow and deliberate, and finding in the morning nothing but Duke's paw prints in the dust, but spaced wrong, too far apart, like something had been taking longer strides than 4 legs should allow. That's when the youngest daughter, Emily, 13 years old, said something that made both of her parents go quiet. She said Duke had been coming to her window at night, not barking, not scratching, just sitting outside the glass, watching her sleep, and when she'd wake up and look at him, he'd already be looking back. She said it felt like he was waiting for something. There was one more detail Emily hadn't told anyone at first. one she only mentioned after her parents had already started comparing notes of their own. She said that a few nights before she noticed Duke at her window, she'd heard him make a sound she'd never heard him make before. Not a bark, not a whine, but something closer to a low, drawn-out hum. Almost like he was trying to imitate a human voice and couldn't quite get the shape of it right. She said it lasted only a few seconds. Long enough that she sat up in bed, heart pounding, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't, not that night. But it happened twice more over the following week, always well past midnight, always coming from just outside her window. And each time, she said, it sounded a little less like a dog trying to make noise, and a little more like something trying to talk. Carla and Roy hadn't heard it themselves, not directly, but they didn't dismiss it either. Not anymore. Not after everything else they'd already seen with their own eyes. Roy started sleeping with a flashlight on the nightstand. Carla started checking the locks twice before bed, something she hadn't done since they'd first moved onto the property years earlier. Neither of them said the word out loud yet, not to each other. But it was there, sitting in the room with them the same way Duke had started sitting outside doors and windows, quiet and patient and watching. For a family that had grown up in that part of the country, surrounded by ranchers and old-timers who didn't talk about certain things in daylight, there was already a word sitting at the back of everyone's mind. Skinwalker. Here's a condensed version at approximately 300 words, keeping the same tone and storytelling style. A skinwalker is rooted in Navajo tradition, though the version most people know today has been reshaped by decades of campfire stories until it barely resembles the original belief. Traditionally, it's said to be a witch who broke sacred taboos and gained the ability to transform into animals. In modern folklore, it's something even simpler and more unsettling. An animal that isn't really an animal. Something wearing a creature's skin like a disguise, blending into farms and neighborhoods until it decides to reveal that something is terribly wrong. The Hensleys weren't people who believed in stories like that. Roy had spent his life around ranchers who laughed at supernatural tales, and Carla always looked for logical answers first, so they started there. The veterinarian found Duke perfectly healthy. Blood tests were normal. No illness, no injury, no neurological problems. The explanation was stress, perhaps age, or a change in routine. Dogs sometimes develop unusual behaviors. It sounded reasonable. It explained nothing happening inside that house. Carla borrowed one of Roy's trail cameras and mounted it on the porch, where Duke spent every night staring into the darkness. For 3 nights, everything looked normal. On the 4th, the camera captured 11 silent seconds. Duke stood at the edge of the trees, perfectly still, facing the camera without moving a muscle. Then, just before the recording ended, his head slowly tilted at an angle Carla insisted no dog should have been able to make. She replayed the clip over and over. She never let Emily see it, because the video answered nothing. It couldn't explain the footprints that didn't match 4-legged tracks. It couldn't explain why Duke's face seemed almost human for a single instant in the fading light. And it couldn't explain how a 13-year-old girl woke in the middle of the night with the certainty that something outside her bedroom window had already been watching her long before she opened her eyes. So Roy did what a lot of people out in that part of the country still do, quietly, without telling their neighbors. He called an older man who lived 2 ranches over, a man everyone just referred to as Mr. Begay, who'd spent his whole life around the land and the stories that came with it, and who'd dealt, allegedly, with something like this once before, decades earlier. Mr. Begay didn't laugh at him. That, more than anything, was what scared Roy the most. He told Roy that a skinwalker, if that's really what this was, wouldn't be interested in the animal itself. The animal was just the shape it was borrowing. What it wanted was the family, their attention, their fear, their routines. It would watch. It would wait for a moment when the family let their guard down completely. He told Roy one thing that stuck with the family for a long time afterward. If you say its name out loud, if you say what you think it is directly to its face, it knows that you know. And that's the moment everything changes. Roy didn't know whether to believe any of it. But 3 nights later, he found himself standing in the yard at 2 a.m, staring at Duke, who was sitting motionless by the fence, watching the house the way he'd been watching it for weeks. Roy said the words anyway, quietly, almost embarrassed to be saying them out loud to a dog. "I know what you are," he said. Duke's head turned toward him, slow, that same unnatural tilt Carla had described weeks earlier. And for a long moment, nothing happened at all, just a dog and a man and the wide, dark country around them. Then Duke stood up, walked toward the tree line, and didn't come back that night. He came back the next morning, tail wagging, food bowl instincts fully restored, sleeping at the foot of Emily's bed again like nothing had ever happened. The family never fully agreed on what to make of that. Roy wanted to believe it had been something else entirely. An illness, a strange coincidence of behaviors compounding on each other until the family had scared themselves into seeing a pattern that wasn't really there. Carla wasn't so sure. She still says to this day that something in that house had been paying attention to them for weeks, and that whatever it was, it left the moment it realized it had been seen. Emily won't say much about it at all anymore. She just says Duke's her dog again, and that's enough for her. That's usually where these stories end, not with an answer, but with a family choosing, quietly, to move forward without one. Because that's the part that never sits right, no matter how many times you hear a story like this. It's not the strides in the dust, or the face that didn't look right for 1 second, or the eyes that didn't catch the light the way they should have. It's the waiting. The idea that something could sit at the edge of a family's ordinary, unremarkable life for weeks, watching, learning their routines, wearing something familiar as a shape to hide inside, and that the only thing that made it leave was being looked at directly and named. Whatever was living behind Duke's eyes for those few weeks, the Hensleys don't talk about it much anymore. But Carla still sleeps with the porch light on, and Emily still checks her window before she closes the curtains every single night, just to make sure nothing's looking back. Subscribe for more stories, for there is always a story to tell.